Bill Buchanan, at 10 years old, moved into an apartment in a castle, the castle on the Cumberland. But the castle wasn't really a castle. It's Kentucky's maximum security prison, has been since the 1800s. The castle on the Cumberland, though, was his home because you see, his daddy was the warden there for 17 years. His dad oversaw the execution of 51 people. And Bill, he graduated from high school there. And there was a reunion coming up, and he decided to come home and visit. And so in 1989, Bobbie Foust had the opportunity to visit with Bill, who by now was a writer and a professor. He had spent a tour in the Air Force, and he was coming home. What'd you learn, Bobbie?
I learned a tremendous amount from, especially about the prison and the interaction of the prison, of the inmates at the prison with the outside world, and also about a young man who grew up grew up in prison, and that's how he described it. Bill Buchanan described it to me in 1989 when he came home to attend his I believe it was 1943 when he graduated, along with newspaper owner Francis Backus, for whom I was working at that time. And Francis was delighted to have Bill come by the newspaper, and he spent hours there actually talking and visiting, and he was a delightful person to talk with. He was just so articulate, and he could express himself so well. And he talked about, at that time, he was getting prepared to write a book he called Execution Eve. And that was about the execution of 3 men who were arrested, charged, and found guilty in the murders of famed woman golfer Marion Miley and her mother at the Lexington Golf and Country Club, where they had an apartment. Marion's mother, Elsie, lived there, and Marion lived, when she was at home, she lived with her mother. And these 3 men were Thomas Penny, who was a petty criminal and had been, he was an ex-convict. He had been convicted of some violent crimes. And Robert Anderson, a Lexington nightclub owner, and Raymond Baxter. Raymond Baxter was a simple-minded person, groundskeeper at the country club, and actually Elsie Miley, Marion's mother, had befriended him, and he was a friend of hers, but he was charged with having arrangements so that Penny and accomplices could enter the country club, and they wanted to rob it. This groundskeeper had told Penny that the golf club often took in as much as $20,000 over a weekend period, and that told him that the money was kept in a lockbox there at the country club. So on September the 28th, 1941, these men entered the country club, shot Marion Miley, and killed her immediately. She was considered to be the second most best woman golfer in the world, and she was a contemporary of Patty Berg and Babe Dietrichson, later Babe Dietrichson Zaharias, and she was on her way. Most people who are of knowledge in the golf world said that Marion Miley was on her way to becoming the #1 woman golfer in the world, professional golfer. And she was killed on the spot there in the country club where she lived, and her mother was shot. And but she lived a little while. She lived long enough to get to a neighbor of the country club and let them know what had happened. And but she later died in the hospital. So these men were, after an investigation, these men were arrested, and tried and found guilty of, they were scheduled to die in the electric chair at Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville and did in fact die by electrocution on February the 26th, 1943. Well, Bill Buchanan had written his college thesis. Bill had grown up in the penitentiary, as you said. He had attended old Eddyville High School. He graduated there and moved on to the University of Louisville, where he graduated, after which after graduating from the University of Louisville, he then joined the Air Force, and he retired from the Air Force. I think he spent about more than 20 years, about 27 years, I believe. He told me he had spent in the Air Force, and he retired, and he settled in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And but he had written his college thesis on this case, this particular case. And the reason he had done that, his father, Jess Buchanan, was he was a mighty man, so to speak. He stood 6'8", weighed 300 pounds, and his biceps were considered to be the size of an ordinary man's thigh. And so therefore he was known as the last king of the hill. And the inmates gave Jess Buchanan no guff. He was in fact king of the hill. But Jess Buchanan presided over the execution of 51 men. Well, these three, there was one of them, Robert Anderson, the nightclub owner, that he, until the very last hour, Jess Buchanan was not convinced that he was a guilty man. He had been found guilty by a jury, but Jess Buchanan had doubts in his mind. And one reason, Thomas Penny had confessed when he was arrested. He had confessed to the murders, and he had implicated Robert Anderson and Raymond Baxter in the killing. But later on, Thomas Penny got religion. He became a devout Catholic, and he recanted the fingering of Anderson, but he refused to go before a judicial hearing and testify to that fact. So Jess Buchanan was faced with a terrible dilemma. He dreaded, Bill told me that his father lived in fear and dread of executing an innocent person. At that particular time, he was a hang 'em high lawman. He had been a sheriff in Union County. He had been a U.S. Marshal, and he was a strong supporter of the death penalty. After this experience with these three men, Jess Buchanan became an opponent of the death penalty and spoke throughout the country, became a national spokesman as an opponent of the death penalty, testified before Congress. So this was the thesis that Bill had written in college. Well, now he had already written, I think, about 5 books at that particular time. And he was getting ready to write this book of, he called Execution Eve, and that was the final title given to the book. I have a copy of it and read it. But Bill said his father was in doubt until the very, very last hour. And he had persuaded the governor, I think the governor was King Johnson at that time, and he had persuaded him to give him an opportunity to change the order of execution. And through that procedure, now Bill wouldn't give away the secret of the book, and neither shall I. And in case someone wants to go to the library and buy read the book, check it out, or it's probably still available in bookstores for purchase. So, in the last hour, Jess Buchanan hit upon this procedure. And he, through investigations that he did, poring over records night and day, and through this announcement that he would change the order of execution, this somehow helped him to convince himself that these men were, that Robert Anderson was indeed guilty. And Robert Anderson was in fact executed on February the 26th, 1943. And Bill, this was 1989 that I was talking to Bill. He had not written Execution Eve at that point. He later, I later talked to him. I stayed in touch with him throughout this time after he left New Mexico. Many people I stayed in contact with after I had interviewed them, because they had interesting stories to tell and continuing stories that were continuing. And Bill Buchanan was one of those. His story was continuing because he was writing this book, and he had started writing it as a novel, as fiction, but then he said it just wasn't working. Nonfiction just wasn't working. Well, one of his friends in New Mexico suggested that he write it as it was, write it as nonfiction, write what you remember about it. His friend told him. He said he went back and he did it, and he said, I had it. I knew I had it. And so I talked to him from time to time when he was in the process of writing it, getting it published. And then when he published it, he contacted me, and I did a story. At that time, I was with the Paducah Sun, and I did a story about him. And I also actually did what we called a package. I did a story about Bill and having written Execution Eve, and also about his father, describing his father and who he was, and how he came to change his opinion of the death penalty. And Jess Buchanan and Bill came to agree with his father in the end. Bill had been a proponent of the death penalty himself, but he came to agree with his father that the death penalty, not because of its barbarity, but because of what it does to the dehumanization of the people who have to carry out the death sentence. He said he saw the effects of carrying out the death penalty on his father and others involved with that particular procedure. And so that he wrote about it, and he also wrote about his father. So he told me about his father, and I was able to do two separate stories with photographs of the electric chair at Eddyville, and photograph of Bill, and photograph of his father, Jess Buchanan. And Jess, of course, had died many years before, but Bill wanted to publicize his father's experience.
So, Bobbie, he also wrote a number of other books.
Yes,
correct?
yes. He actually, I think he wrote 7 books. I think he wrote another book after writing Execution Eve. The books that he wrote, One Last Time was one of them. Present Danger was one of them. The Senator and the Sun Eater. I haven't read any of those books. And another one was Diablo, the Devil's Steer. And another one was Running Toward the Light. Bill gave me a copy of Running Toward the Light. I still somewhere still have that book. I finally managed to read it, but and when I first started reading it, it was so emotionally draining that I just couldn't finish it at the time. It's about John Barker, who was a runner in the 1970s, and he was a young man. He was planning to train for the Olympics, and just prior to turning 25, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And he spent he was given 6 months to live, but Bill, in his book, Bill said he turned 6 months into 18 months of working with young people and helping them to overcome obstacles, and just being a mentor for many young people. He never made it to the Olympics, but he became a man of high standing as a mentor for young people, but he did die, and he did succumb to cancer. And Bill wrote the story about it, and it still causes me some emotion to think about it and think about he died at 26 years old.
So Bill wrapped up his career in New Mexico.
Yes, yes.
Was he brought back to Kentucky as a resting place, or did he remain in New Mexico?
He remained in New Mexico. Bill died in 2005, in March of 2005, and I hadn't talked to him for a while, but I did get word of his passing, and sent condolences to his family. I never met his wife or his children. He and his wife had children, and I never, I'm not even sure that I ever asked him why he settled in New Mexico. Many people do. I have relatives who settled in New Mexico and Arizona after having spent time in after retiring from the military, in fact. So he just possibly one reason was he became a professor at the University of New Mexico, and he also he taught many courses in writing. He also wrote articles for Reader's Digest. He had many articles published in Reader's Digest. He was a prolific writer, so that may have been one reason, the fact that he was associated with the University of New Mexico.